Well, good morning. We are just starting a little delayed, but we will adjust as we go. So welcome to the second day of the conference, the translation movement between East and West. And we will start today with the first panel that's composed of three spectacular presentations. It's called the third translation movement from Latin European languages to Arabic, Ottoman, Persian in early modern and pre-modern period. Our first speaker is Dr. Haila Manteghi. She's teaching. She's affiliated with the University of Münster in Germany, but previously studied in Spain and England. And she has a very interesting book called Alexander the Great in the Persian Tradition. And she's currently working on a Spanish Jesuit, Jerome Xavier, and the Mughal Empire. And we look forward to her talk on knowledge transfer in early modern Mughal India. Ale, floor is yours.
So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer that gave me this opportunity to be here. And I'm honored that since Professor Kim didn't make it, I'm the only woman speaking in this conference. As our chair said, I started to work on this Jesuit missionary, and I worked on another. I started my project working on another work by him, which is called Aine Haqnama, and on his Ādāb al-Salṭanat. I just recently started, so I have more questions than answers. So looking forward to your comments and suggestions. This is the outline of my presentation. I will give a very brief introduction as the historical context, who were these Jesuits and his local scholar al-Sattār and their works, and some conclusion. The last survivors of the House of Taymour, the Mughals, drew invaluable political capital from their lineage. Like Portuguese, they were foreigners in India. However, due to their loyalty to the Taymurid past, they were able to adopt local customs and create new concepts of politics and religion. In order to establish an imperial cult and under the idea of a universal kingship, Akbar initiated the translation bureau, Maktab Khane, especially to translate works from Sanskrit and other languages into Persian. This Mughal translation project was a strategic endeavor to achieve political integration and the assertion of imperial authority, executed through a collaborative effort involving scholars from different traditions. It was part of his broader policy of peace for all, Solh Kol, as an instrument to imperial ambition as a universal king. At the turn of the Islamic millennium, and under its messianic atmosphere, Akbar claimed the spiritual leadership and established a mystical imperial order, not only for Muslims, but for all the subjects of the empire. The official sources present him as a universal manifestation of the divine, able to transcend religious divisions and thereby restore order to the invisible world. Jahangir inherited this messianic kingship adapted to the South Asian environment. So, Jerónimo Espeleta Igoni, known as Jerome Xavier, was a Spanish Jesuit missionary under the Portuguese Padroado in Goa, arrived at the Mughal court under such circumstances. So Akbar had such interreligious debates at his court and was also interested in Christian faith, so asked the Franciscans to send a representative of Catholic kind of Christianity, since the St. Thomas Christian existed in India since the 1st century. And the Franciscans told him that the Jesuits were better educated for such interreligious debates. So there have been 3 Jesuit missions to the court of Akbar, and Xavier was the head of the 3rd Jesuit mission. He spent almost 20 years at the court during Akbar's and Jahangir's rule. And from his arrival in Lahore in May 1595, he made efforts to learn Persian at the age of 45, and only some months later, he claimed that he had no more need of interpreters. Thus, the Mughal court became a significant site for renewed direct engagement with European intellectual traditions. Emperor Akbar detected this chance to access classical Greek and Roman texts directly from Western sources. Therefore, he commissioned Xavier and a local scholar, ʿAbd Lāhōrī, to write on Greek philosophy, Roman emperors, religion, and European history. The fruits of their collaboration result in various works, from which two are to interest of my talk: Ādāb al-Salṭanat, dated 1609, and the Samarat al-Falāsifa, dated 1603. Both works make use of a Western exemplar dealing with the manners and duties of kingship from a moral and religious perspective. Akbar was always in search of knowledge and had books read out to him, especially the Akhlaq Nasiri, according to his chief minister Abul Fazl. Under 2C's message of acceptance, Akbar put efforts in understanding as well as in facilitating conditions for his subjects to appreciate each other's religion and tradition. One of his efforts is the commission of translations of the sacred books of different religions existed in India. This effort also led him to create the Ibadat-khane, house of worship, at his capital Fatehpur Sikri, where the representatives of different faiths discuss theological and philosophical matters. In this miniature painting, it's from the Akbarname, and it depicts Mughal Emperor Akbar holding a religious assembly in the Ibadat-khane. The two men dressed in black are the Jesuit missionaries Rudolfo Acquaviva and Francisco Enriquez from the first Jesuit mission. In this context, Akbar became interested in the Christian texts, Greek and Roman philosophy, and European history. al-Sattār makes it clear in the preface of the Samarat al-Falāsifa that it was Akbar himself who ordered him to learn the Farangi language and write about the secrets of this nation, their sovereigns, tales, and Greek and Latin philosophers. However, he was not able to fulfill this task until the presence of the Christians, Guruh Nasara, made it possible, especially through Xavier's assistance. Sattār showed great respect to Xavier at the beginning of their collaboration. In Samarat al-Falāsifa, he named Xavier as the one of the selected wise men of Europe. However, in the Majalis Jahangiri, which is another work done by al-Sattār, he reflected another impression, affirming that although Xavier, the foremost scholar of the West, is a wise man and his understanding is very accurate in everything, he is a naive man regarding the religious issues. The reason was mentioned later in the work, where al-Sattār also affirms that during his collaboration with the Padres, he obtained such prejudice and enmity, ta'assub wa dushmani, that he did not have at the beginning. One can assume that during Akbar, they collaborated with each other, producing the Mir'at al-Quds, which is a Vita Christi and is very well studied. It is translated into English by Willer Faxton, and it contains very beautiful miniatures. And then Dastan Ahval Havariyun is another work that they did together, and then Samarat al-Falāsifa, but their relation darkened. So my conclusion, based on another work of Xavier, Aine Haqnama, was that when Akbar died, this collaboration also ended. In order to render the work into Persian, Sattār writes that he dedicated himself to learn the language, and in 6 months he was able to understand the scientific and practical topics, but not to converse, since he has spent most of the time in producing translation and did not have the opportunity to speak much. Among his sources, he named the Bible and a book of San Antonin, which must be the Dominican Archbishop of Florence, Antonio Pierossi or Saint Antoninus, and his Summa Historialis. This 3-volume work appeared in print between 1474 and 1479 and was reprinted in several times thereafter in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The Jesuits apparently carried it to the Mughal court as part of their library. Whether they gave Sattār access to other more recent materials in Latin, since he apparently did not read Portuguese, remains unclear. Sattār continues to specify the content of his sources being a report on the affairs of the Roman and Greek emperors. And he mentioned, for example, the foundation of Rome and other parts of his sources reminds the translation made by Xavier, mentioned in a list which is written by Morandi, who was also another Jesuit some decades later in Agra. And Morandi wrote this list based on the works that he himself saw in Agra. And being, for instance, Plutarch, Tullius, and the foundation of Rome and its king. Did Sattār incorporated this translation into his Samarat, or did they translate them together in the process of learning the languages for Xavier Persian and Latin for Sattār? These questions need to be addressed from my research. Sattār names Xavier twice in the Samarat al-Falāsifa and mentioned that he owed the credit to the Padre. When we have a look at this list, we notice that Plutarch is mentioned various times. This leads me to Xavier's work, Ādāb al-Salṭanat, which is known through 2 manuscripts, one in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and one in Rome and at Casanatense Library. The work was dedicated to Jahangir and was completed in 1609 at the Royal Court in Agra. The manuscript in Rome is addressed to Claudio Acquaviva, the General of the Society of Jesus, and the other one in London was signed by Xavier himself for the Florentine traveler Giambattista Vecchietti. So since we do not have, I didn't find any copy in Pakistan, India, or Iran, so I assume that its circulation was limited. The text, it can have some reasons. One can be that the text ignores the rich background of mirror for prince genre that existed in Persian tradition. Probably Xavier had no interest or was not aware of it. I have to open a parenthesis here. Recently, I was in a conference and Fabrizio Speciale, who is the head of the project Perso Indica, preparing an encyclopedia based on this translation movement in Akbar's time, told me that the fact that we only have 2 manuscripts in European libraries doesn't mean that it was not popular or the circulation was limited. Many manuscripts were lost in India. So one thing is that, but I think that since we don't have copies in any part of the Persianate world, it can be because Xavier, within the Jesuit method of accommodation, tried to bring many examples from the Persian kings in this mirror for prince, without knowing that the Persian kings were not known at this time in Persia. So it is interesting because this Ādāb al-Salṭanat was written down in 1609, and 1 year later, in 1610, we have Pedro Teixeira, who was a Portuguese in Hormuz and wrote a work on kings of Hormuz, and he started with the Persian kings according to the Persian tradition, and he expressed that he was so perplexed that the Persian kings were not known in Persia according to the Greco-Roman tradition, because he had access to some manuscript of the Shahnameh, and he incorporated them into the Persian kings of the Shahnameh tradition into his king of Hormuz tradition. So it was not known for Europeans that the Cyrus the Great and so on were not known anymore in the Persian world. That can be also one point, that it was not very it was not copied so much in Iran. Regarding the content of this manuscript, Xavier claims that the book is based on Plutarch's 4 principles written during the Trajan Caesar. Therefore, his Ādāb al-Salṭanat contains 4 main chapters or fasl. How the king should deal with God, with himself, with his grandees and officials, and with his people. So, in Plutarch's corpus, especially in his Moralia, there are 2 main contexts where he deals with the education or conduct of rulers. To an educated ruler, Plutarch address the philosophical education and lists 4 guiding elements: reason, law, justice, and knowledge. And in the precepts of a statecraft, he gives practical advice for a statesman, how to deal with citizens, allies, officials, passions, and virtue. He does not number them into 4 principles, but he organizes moral duties according to relationships. One's relationship with the gods, with oneself, with colleagues and subordinates, and with people at large. So Xavier's mirror adapts the moral architecture into a systematic Christian mirror for prince, allowing each relation with Christian virtues: piety, prudence, justice, and charity. The Jesuit thus translates Plutarch's civic humanism into a theological idiom suitable for a South Asian court context, where explicit references to Greco-Roman exempla were meant to signal learned universality. The Jesuit and his sources have systematized Plutarch's dispersed moral teachings into a 4-fold mirror structure that mirrors the king's vertical relation to God and horizontal relation to his own nature, court, and people. So let's have a look closely at what's happening here, because Plutarch never enumerated these as 4 principles. So this, what we have here in Ādāb al-Salṭanat is modeled through Renaissance compilation of moral philosophy. Erasmus, for instance, Institutio Principis Christiani, is fundamental for later Christian mirrors, and Erasmus was not Jesuit, but he was quoted and adopted by Jesuits like Mariana, whose Rege was one of the key texts which systematized the mirror for princes model used by Xavier. And I would like also to mention Rivadeneira, who was at the same time in Philip I's court, and he wrote Tratado de la Religión de Virtudes que debe tener el Príncipe Cristiano, and in this work he has the same topics that we can find in Ādāb al-Salṭanat, and it's curious that it was published in Madrid 1595, the same year that Xavier arrived in Lahore. So I'm not sure if Xavier could have access in such very recent published works, because since he was in Mughal India, not even in Goa. But it's interesting that he is also transmitting the same ideas that were in circulation in European courts at the same time by his Jesuit brothers. So Plutarch himself never explicitly lists 4 principles of kingships in that exact form. Xavier and other Renaissance moralists distilled Plutarch's moral political teachings into a 4-fold schema of royal duties. So drawing on a Renaissance Jesuit interpretation of Plutarch, meditated through all these other Jesuits, Mariana, Rivadeneira. So by writing the Ādāb al-Salṭanat, Xavier is not only transmitting the Greco-Roman tradition, but also the political thoughts that were in circulation in European courts. These works show how the Jesuit mission, a religious enterprise, acted as a significant vehicle for the transfer and transmission of political and philosophical knowledge, resulting in hybrid texts that reflect the complex interplay between European and Indo-Persian traditions of advice literature. Furthermore, the process of their creation involving collaboration between a missionary and a Mughal scholar reveals the complex dynamics of knowledge acquisition, adaptation, and potential syncretism. It deepens our understanding of how religious context facilitated the transfer and transmission of knowledge in Indo-Persian world during the early modern period, shedding light on the interplay between religious frameworks and the circulation of political thought. Thank you.
We have a lot of questions, but let's keep our questions to the end of the panel. Our second speaker is going to also focus on early modern period. Professor Ahmet Tunc Sen is teaching at Columbia University. He just published a groundbreaking book called Forgotten Experts, Astrologers, Science and Authority in the Ottoman Empire by Stanford University Press. So it should be a book promotion for you too. And he's going to tell us about Astral Ambitions, Translation and Science in the Reign of Mustafa III. Tunc?
Well, let me start by thanking Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation for organizing this exciting symposium series, and specifically to Mr. Salih Shahsevari and Mr. Sharaf Yamini for having me here. In my research, I really enjoy thinking about and working on the sovereigns and their intellectual interests. I think they matter, especially for astral sciences for which funding mechanisms are pretty limited in terms of institutional frameworks and the structures of those funding mechanisms. And today I'll talk about one such sovereign, Mustafa III from the late 18th century, but I have to confess that this is not my particular field of expertise. 18th century is a period that I'm only recently interested in, thanks to this particular person. In my earlier work, I studied another Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II, who lived and reigned in the late 15th and early 16th century. And I'd like to start by saying a few things about Bayezid II, not just to promote my own book or the work, but I think it's relevant to better understand Mustafa III and how his case was both similar and different from the earlier Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II. So, Bayezid II was truly a philosopher king, a sultan, scientist in terms of his deep interest in not just astral sciences, but also other sorts of philosophical knowledge. I know Bayezid II has not been credited yet compared to his more famous father, Mehmet II, or his more famous grandson, Süleyman. But we should really pay more attention to Bayezid II and his significance, because during his time, during his period, there were significant developments in Ottoman administration, bureaucracy, policy making, and also certain intellectual pursuits conducted at his own time. So he was not just a generous patron of scientists and intellectuals, but he was also interested in studying the science itself. We know that he spent time with this important person, Mirim Çelebi, who was the grandson of Ali Kushçi, the famous astronomer of the Samarkand Observatory. So we know that they read together certain books, including the famous astronomical tables of Ulugh Bey, produced in Samarkand. There are so many texts written in astral sciences that were dedicated to Bayezid II, including some translations, and several contemporaries of Bayezid II also attest to the fact that Bayezid II was a kind of philosopher king, a very learned sultan. And we can find manuscript and material evidence of this basic fact. Over 10 different manuscripts specifically devoted to astronomical and astrological sciences were owned by Bayezid II, thanks to, again, the ownership statements you can find in the first folios of these manuscripts. Texts like compilations of different astronomical and astrological texts, or Nasreddin Tusi's recension of Almagest, or an introductory textbook on astrology, like Madkhal ila Ahkam al-Nujum, or a treatise on astrolabe, again, personally owned by Bayezid II, which were most probably used during their training sessions with this Mirim Çelebi that I mentioned earlier. Again, I mean, one is spoiled for choice when finding manuscript evidence for Bayezid II's deep interest in astral sciences. In those treatises dedicated to Bayezid II himself, you can also find interesting remarks underlining what kind of a character Bayezid II was. Of course, these remarks were usually bombastic, and we shouldn't take them for granted, but I find them important again for displaying Bayezid II's interest in scientific and philosophical matters. In one case, for instance, Bayezid II is depicted as the wise and knowledgeable one who was well learned in sciences celestial and terrestrial. And by looking at the observations of his contemporaries, including those Italians or the Arabic-speaking poets, or the Ottoman subjects, again, Bayezid II's interest in astronomy and astrology is well attested. Andrea Gritti, the Venetian diplomat and tradesman, who spent some time in Istanbul, close to the court of Bayezid II, says, for instance, Bayezid is a very learned person in astrology and astronomy, as well as theology. A similar remark was also made by Ibn al-Ulayf, who again observed what was going on in Istanbul at the time, and specifically at the court of the Sultan. And this interest of Bayezid II also triggered certain complaints among his contemporaries, and I came across this petition available now in the Topkapı Palace, written by a Sufi master of different esoteric practices. So he was particularly upset about Bayezid II's interest in both astronomy, astrology, and other philosophical sciences, because as he puts it in this petition, what Bayezid II needed is rather the mastery that this Sufi expert could actually provide him. We have this very colossal inventory of the palace library that was drafted in 1502, 1503, and it recently became an important publication on the intellectual history of the Ottoman world at the turn of the 16th century. And when we look at this inventory, there are so many books devoted to astronomical and astrological sciences. There are, the whole inventory lists around 7,000 books available in the Ottoman Palace Library by the turn of the 16th century, and 500 of them are specifically about astronomical and astrological texts, including certain important works by this ancient astral authority, Ptolemy. I put here all those copies available about the Ptolemaic corpus, but when we look at that, we see that they are only about the so-called Ptolemaic astrological text Centiloquium, the 100 sayings, but we know that it was not actually Ptolemy's own work, but rather an Arabic work produced in the 10th century. So we don't have, for instance, here the Ptolemy's more famous astrological work, Tetrabiblos. And in the rest of my talk, I'll talk about that, and that's how I'm gonna connect it to the Mustafa III's era. Another important thing I just want to mention here is that although Bayezid II was very interested in astronomical and astrological sciences, and he was well versed in these disciplines, that this interest did not translate into a kind of translation movement. So this is a question I just want to raise. I mean, did intellectual interests of sovereigns always translate into a sort of translation movement? Because in the Bayezid II's time, they did not really bother themselves to translate works in Arabic and Persian to Ottoman Turkish, because they were the Sultan himself was well versed in Arabic and Persian, and there was really no real need for translating works into Turkish. But this was not really the case in Mustafa III's time by the 18th century. The only exceptions I was able to find, again, in the time of Bayezid II, is this work by a new convert to Islam, ʿAbd al-Muhtadi. He was probably one of those Sephardic Jews who ended up in Istanbul in the late 15th or early 16th century. And this guy translated a work on astronomical instrument, again at the special request of the Sultan, Bayezid II. Another exception from the time in terms of translations from European languages into Islamic languages is the translation of Abraham Zacuto's Almanac Perpetuum. This text is an important text in the 16th century European circles. It was the most one of the most recent production of astronomical tables that were important for practicing of astrology. And we know that the text was translated into Arabic by another Jewish emigre scientist in the Ottoman court, Moses Galeano, at the special request of this gentleman, Muayyadzadeh. But he is important because he was one of the closest intellectual companions of Bayezid II. So I assume Bayezid was also very much involved in the translation process of Galeano's Almanac Perpetuum translation. Bayezid II's peculiarity is also confirmed by Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu's table here, that you can find in his Ottoman Science Tradition, published by the Al-Furqan Foundation. There is this very useful list of Ottoman sultans to whom different scientific treatises were dedicated, and Bayezid II here is really the leading figure with over 70 different treatises. These abbreviations are let me just mention OASTLT, which is the Ottoman Astrological Literature, and the first one, OALT, it's the Ottoman Astronomical Literature. So 30 specifically astronomical texts and 14 specifically astrological texts were dedicated to Bayezid II, which makes him, again, really a special character. But when we take a closer look into the list, we realize that there is another sultan to whom 13 astrological texts were dedicated, and that's Mustafa III. Okay? So I know Mustafa III is only in the sixth place in terms of all those books dedicated to the sultans, but in terms of astrological texts themselves, he was the second one after Bayezid II himself. Okay, So, in the rest of my talk, I'll speak about Mustafa III's intellectual interests and some of the translations made during his own time that are specifically about astrology and astronomy. But again, as I already confessed, 18th century is really not my particular field of expertise. And we have the real experts here, like Harun, who did work on 18th century scientific practices of the Ottomans. But his time is still interesting and important in terms of what was really going on in the Ottoman context at the time. There were several attempts to improve the military technology of the Ottoman Empire due to the constant defeats and losses, especially during the Ottoman-Russian warfare of the 18th century. Some European experts were invited to the Ottoman lands, including Baron de Tott, who also talks a lot about Mustafa III, the Ottoman Sultan's interests in astrology. There were new schools for, running engineering projects, or again improving military technology. So on the one hand, in the 18th century, especially in the second half of the 18th century, there is an interest in modernizing the army, modernizing the administration. But at the same time, we have a sultan here who was deeply, deeply interested in astrology. And this is, again, a fact well attested by his contemporaries. I mean, if you read any chronicle produced at the time of Mustafa III, you would come across remarks underlining how Mustafa was very interested in astrology itself. And they even named him as Najm al-Salatin, the star of all Ottoman sultans. Yeah. And one can also corroborate this fact through certain archival documents available in the state archives of the Ottomans. This is just one example of an imperial rescript. So in this particular imperial rescript, we come across a sultan trying to put his hands on Persian astrological texts that had been available in his Grand Vizier's estate. So he was very insistent on having his hands on this particular copy. And he just orders his man to find the book no matter what. And there is another imperial rescript that also attests to Mustafa III's learnedness in astrological sciences, a fact that was even said by Sultan himself. I rely on the transcription of this particular document made by this recent PhD recipient, Cem Görür, who talks about Mustafa III's daily life and his religious and other sorts of intellectual interests. So in this particular imperial rescript, Mustafa III, complains about some of his military personnel's reliance on astrologers and fortune tellers and dream interpreters instead of taking necessary measures for wars. And he says in this particular imperial rescript that no one had occupied themselves with the signs of stars as much as I had. And there is really no competent astrologer among those people on whom these military personnel really rely on. So he provides us a critique of the astrologers and other types of fortune tellers in his own time, and underlining how well versed he was in terms of reading these texts. And And to come to the very crux of this presentation, during his own time, he specifically ordered several individuals to translate into Turkish some astrological texts. These include his chief court physician, Abdülaziz Efendi, who translated two works specifically about astrology. One is this Persian text produced originally in the 12th century, Burhan al-Kifaya. And when we read the preface of this text, we come across this remark that this was specifically ordered by Mustafa III. The same guy, Hekimbaşı Abdülaziz Efendi, the chief court physician, also prepared another Persian astrological text, which was much more popular in its own time than the previous one. Ali al-Bukhari's Ashjar al-Asmar. There are so many copies of this text read by practicing munajjims, astrologers. But this is the first time that the text in Persian was translated into Turkish, again with the order of Mustafa III. And when we read the preface of this particular translation, we come across references to learnedness of Mustafa III. The chief physician just says that although Mustafa was the foremost and most exalted among the learned men of his time, and he was unmatched in resolving some lexicographic intricacies of Arabic and Persian, he still ordered me to translate this noble composition into the Turkish language so that everyone might partake of the benefits and advantages of its content. So if we take this kind of remark for granted, we can make an argument that there is an effort of the Sultan to make this kind of knowledge public, instead of just keeping it for himself or keeping it for just the royal consumption, which is pretty different than what was taking place during the time of Bayezid II in the early 16th century. In addition to astrological texts, Mustafa III also commissioned the translation of some most recent astronomical tables, including those produced in France. Chinari Ismail Efendi, who was one of the timekeepers in an Istanbul mosque complex at the time, was commissioned to translate the Jacques Cassini's astronomical tables that were prepared in 1840s, at the Paris Observatory, and he completed this translation into Turkish at the request of Mustafa III. It's the same Ismail Efendi, Chinari Ismail Efendi, who also produced works in astrology, including annual prognostications or the birth horoscopes of Mustafa III's old kids. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to those Kandilli observatory manuscripts at the time, that I can't really share with you the images of those texts. But in, again, the state archives of the Ottomans, so the state archives of the Ottomans are important not just for political matters, but if you're a historian of science, there are so many relevant materials one can find in those state archives, including texts like these, the birth horoscopes produced by figures like Ismail Chinari Efendi about the birth of Mustafa III. I think, okay.
Extra this time, like soccer game.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you so much. So in the brief abstract of my presentation, I said I would say a few things about the translation of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos into Turkish, which was made for the first time, again, during Mustafa III's reign. And this is that text, produced by a guy named Süleyman Riyazi Efendi. Unfortunately, we don't really know anything about him other than this brief remark made available in the İrsika catalog of Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu. saying that he was the librarian of Hagia Sophia Library, but I really couldn't come across any further information about him. But the nickname he used, Riyazi Effendi, makes us think that he was well versed in mathematical sciences, al-ulum al-riyadiyya. And this is, I believe, manifest in the texts he produced, including this translation of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. But there is just one copy of the text available in the Hamidiya collection, and you come across this reference on the flyleaves of the manuscript saying that this is the commentary of 100 sayings, Sharh Elf Kalima li Batlamyus. But this is a wrong information, because this is really not the text of Saint Lokium. It is really the translation of this particular text, Ali bin Ridwan Tafsir al-Maqalat al-Arba. So this is the Arabic translation slash commentary of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, the authoritative astrological text that was completed in 11th century by Ali bin Ridwan. And there is a really wonderful brief article I came across on the Ptolemaios Arabus et Latinus webpage, produced by Nadine Leur. I believe she completed her dissertation on Tetrabiblos, but I didn't really have a chance to read the book, to read the dissertation. So she provides us with good information about the significance of Ali bin Ridwan and his commentary of the Tetrabiblos. So Süleyman Riyazi Efendi's translation is just a translation of that Arabic commentary, not the original Ptolemaic Tetrabiblos. And it was completed in 1766 or 67. And again, he makes a reference to the learnedness of Mustafa III and how people of knowledge were showered with gifts and rewards in time. But when we look into the details of his translation process, we see that he just mimics how Ali bin Ridwan, in his own commentary of Tetrabiblos, produces text. So in the original text, you see the Qala Batlamyus and then Qala al-Mufassir, and this is how the text runs. In the Turkish translation, he has the exact same structure, Qala Batlamyus and Qala al-Mufassir. So this is, something I find interesting, and I don't have a particular answer, and I really beg for any explanation. But he keeps the Ptolemaic references in Arabic, and he translates just the commentary part. So I don't know why he didn't translate the Ptolemaic statements into Turkish as well, but he decided to keep it in Arabic, but he only translated the commentary of Ridwan bin Ali into Turkish. And he follows the exact order verbatim, including several horoscope charts that are located in Ridwan bin Ali's original text. So he just reproduced the exact same horoscope charts without changing anything significant. The only difference or changes he made are adding some notes here and there with several abbreviations like matlab, or additional information that he thinks are important for making the text much more accessible. But he finishes, and I'm gonna finish by just showing it, by apologizing for all the mistakes or defects one can find in the book, and he simply accuses Ridwan bin Ali for that. If you find any mistakes or defects in my text, don't accuse me. It's really because of Ridwan bin Ali. And on that note, I'm just going to finish. All right. Thank you so much.
Great paper. So our third presenter today is Professor Tofigh Haiderzade. Professor Haiderzade has an MA degree from Istanbul University in 1997. Then he has a PhD in University of Oklahoma and worked on both science and history of science, and has a book called A Physical Theory of Comets from Aristotle to Whipple in 2008. He's currently teaching in University of California, Riverside. His paper is titled Translation as a Vehicle for the Reception of Modern European Science and Technology in Iran. Professor Tofigh Haiderzade. Yes.
Okay, before beginning my presentation, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the hosts of this important scholarly gathering, the director, Mr. Sharafi Amani, and members of the boards of the directors of the Al-Furqan Foundation, especially Professor Cemil Aydin, whose efforts helped connect my research with Al-Furqan's symposium, and of course the organizers and administrative staff, especially Mr. Salih Shahswari and Mamoun Abbasi, for their exemplary work in arranging the event. My presentation focused on the translation movement in Iran, with particular emphasis on translation undertaken to introduce European science and technology into country. This symposium has been highly beneficial for my research, leading to several new findings that I'm pleased to share with you briefly today. Let me begin with an introduction. Iranians' familiarity with European expanded significantly in the second half of the Safavid period, roughly through the 17th century. However, despite this extensive interaction, which I discussed at the first Al-Furqan Symposium on Translation Movement 2 years ago, there is no evidence of enthusiasm among Iranian scholars to seriously engage with or study European products or ideas, even though these were entirely new for them. I emphasize this point because, despite the existence of numerous active madrasas with substantial endowments and hundreds of prominent scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers, there is no indication that that they made any attempt to examine European knowledge, whether to adopt or to reject it. This intellectual attitude, which I have discussed elsewhere, persisted among both scholars and state officials during and after the Qajar period, and continued until the establishment of the Qajar state in final years of 19th century. It was in the early decades of the 19th century that the translation of modern European texts into Persian began and gradually accelerated. However, this movement also was not initiated by educational institutes or madrasas with the purpose of acquainting themselves with European developments, or did it arise from a national strategy aimed at the systematic importation of modern knowledge. Rather, it emerged as a reaction to the military defeats Iran suffered during the Russo-Persian Wars in northwestern Iran from 1804 to 1813 and 1826 to 1828, which exposed the inadequacy of Iran's medieval style army when confronted with modern Russian military. If the first translation movement in the 8th century was the result of triumph and adaptation, the translation efforts of the 19th century in Iran reflected adaptation born of defeat. This war, at the same time, engaged Iran in a bigger battleground known as the Great Game. It was a geopolitical struggle between Britain, Russia, and for a short time France, competing for influence and control in Central and Southeast Asia, particularly over Afghanistan and Persia. Therefore, the early 19th century translation movement in Iran must be explored within the political setting of the era and Iranians' officials' understanding and expectation from the concept of the West and the Western science and technology. Some details of these translation efforts in Iran were discussed in this very place in 2023. Now, I want to discuss some other aspects of the 19th century translation movement in Iran with an emphasis on the translation of modern scientific and technological texts and their impact on the Iranian society. So, however, it's necessary to provide a brief explanation of the translation and the channels through which Iranians gained access to European resources. These conduits can be classified into 6 categories. This is the source that I use. I'll explain about this in a minute. These conduits can be classified in 6 categories. First, European travelers, scholars, diplomats, and envoys who were proficient in the Persian language. The second were Iranians who learned European language, especially French and English, from Europeans residing in Iran, particularly Christian missionaries. Third, bilingual Iranians living in border regions between Iran, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, as well as individuals who immigrated to Russia or the Ottoman Empire. There were also immigrants to India, where some learned English. The fourth group were Iranians educated in Europe. The first group of students sent to England in 1815, the second to France in 1845, followed by additional groups after 1858. The fifth group are graduates of Iran's first European-style Institute of Higher Education, the Dar al-Funun, established in 1851, where most instructors were Europeans, and sixth group, Iranian diplomats abroad. The translation movement in Iran gained momentum after the establishment of Dar al-Funun and accelerated further with the creation of the Government Translation Bureau, or Dar al-Tarjumeh, in 1871. From a geographical perspective, I'm so sorry, I have to go back. From a geographical perspective, in addition to the capital city Tehran, labeled 1 there, 2 other provinces played significant role in the translation movement. Azerbaijan province, with the capital city Tabriz, labeled 2, served as the seat of the Qajar crown princes from the early 19th century and formed the border region with Russia and Ottoman Empire. The Russo-Persian wars took place in this place, and it was here that the first ideas of modernization emerged. The crown prince sent the first groups of Iranian students to England in 1815. It is therefore unsurprising that the earliest translations from French and English, as well as the first printed books, appeared in Tabriz in the early 1820s. A nearby city, the little dot close to number 2 label, is Urumiyeh, became the hub of American and some French missionaries who served local Christian communities, mainly Armenians and Assyrians, as well as Muslims. Between 1837 and 1847, they established 24 schools in Urumiyeh and surrounding districts, a number that grew to 117 schools of the first schools, and they had more than 2,000 students by the end of 19th century. One of the first modern astronomy books was translated into Persian here in 1840, and the missionaries played a key role in teaching English and France. Some of their students later became notable translators. Isfahan, number 3 there, emerged as another center for translation after 1870, when a Qajar prince served as governor of the province for more than 35 years and established a bureau of translation there. So, I would like to continue with some statistics. Fortunately, over the past 15 years, the publication of the Union Catalog of Iranian Manuscripts, which is a 45-volume work containing bibliographic information on about more than 320,000 titles, has gradually facilitated research on manuscripts preserved in Iranian libraries. Although a few existing statistics on translation work have been extracted from the Union Catalog of Iranian Manuscripts, hereafter I call it UCIM, I conducted an independent survey of the catalog to create a detailed database of translated works from the 19th century. These were then categorized. It is an example of the catalog that I made out of that original catalog. And I supplemented with additional information on translated and published works using other bibliographical resources. My subsequent analysis is based on this extracted database. So, the catalog records the existence of manuscripts for approximately 385 translated books and booklets from the 19th century held in Iranian libraries, political reports and correspondence, newspaper articles, contracts and deeds, as well as translation produced abroad, for example, in India or Ottoman Empire or Europe, are excluded from this survey. A comparison between this list and the list of printed books from the same period, I mean in the 19th century, shows that only 20% of these translations were ever published. Conversely, there are also translated and printed books from this period whose information does not appear in the UCIM, suggesting that some translations went directly to print and their manuscripts copy did not survive. Therefore, the actual number of translations is greater than the 385 titles recorded in UCIM. I will return to this point shortly. Table 2 shows the number of books translated before and after the establishment of two important institutes, Darul Funun, the first European-style polytechnic school established in 1851, and the Government Translation Bureau, or Darul Tarjumeh, in 1871. The total number of translations produced in 19th century Iran amounts to approximately 435 titles. However, only about 85 of these, roughly 20%, were printed during this period. In other words, around 80% of the translations were prepared for the patron's use or for circulation within a very limited courtly circle, after which they were stored in the royal libraries. Manuscripts of only some of these translations, mostly those related to historical biographies or medicine, were copied several times. Among three translation centers, Tehran was the most active, followed by Isfahan, which ranked second with a considerable gap, and Tabriz the third place, with relatively few translations work, especially after the 1830s. In Tehran, Nasr-ed-Din Shah, who had some knowledge of French, ruled for nearly half a century from 1848 to 1896, while his eldest son governed Isfahan for 34 years from 1874 to 1904. Most of the unpublished works were translated for these two patrons, and many were recited before them. It was customary for the king, for the Shah, to listen to translated texts recited by one of his leading courtiers, Ābd al-Salṭanat. This statesman, who had studied in Paris and was among the most active translators at the court, believed in the rule of an enlightened monarch and played a significant role in selecting works for translation. He also founded the first censorship bureau within the Ministry of Publication. In the lack of bilingual dictionaries and absence of comedies to standardize Persian equivalents for foreign terms, the translated works suffered incoherency in terminology. Sometimes a term is translated as a sentence, or unfamiliar Arabic equivalents were used, or the foreign terms transliterated in Persian. The latter approach was common practice in early translations of scientific works. On the other hand, though translators had their basic education in the traditional schools, due to the absence of topics related to mathematical and natural sciences, history, and geography in their curriculum, they were not familiar with well-accepted terms of the classical texts. As you see here, using Persian transliteration of diagonal or pyramid or qutr, instead of qutr, or using pyramid for instead of using haram, which was common in Persian language. And you see a list of samples of those words that they should use using the classical words that we have. For example, in their translations, you see Morocco, while we had for hundreds of years using Maghreb instead of Morocco, or the list there, haram or qutr or manshur or wus'at khaliyah for khala, and those kind of things, which shows that they didn't know about the classical terms that we had in the existing books in science or geography or such publications. Since the translations were prepared for the Shah or members of the court, translators were able to explain and interpret difficult concepts or unfamiliar terms while reading the text aloud or after the patron had read it personally. Several translations, particularly in natural science, relied heavily on illustrations to convey meaning. However, in the absence of skilled illustrators, spaces were left blank for the images, and in some cases, the page numbers of the original books were noted to indicate where the illustrations could be found. It is likely that readers were expected to consult the original images while reading the Persian translation. The big difference between the translated but not printed and printed titles can be attributed to three main reasons. First, low literacy rate and high cost of printed books and a limited demand for subjects that interested courtiers all contributed to the restricted circulation of such books. For example, in the 1850s, the price of the most circulated book, the Quran, was equivalent to cost of 190 kilograms of wheat, while the most popular poetry book in Iran, the poems of Hafiz, costs about 95 kilograms of wheat. However, the price of a translation, a history of Peter the Great, was twice that of Quran and 4 times that of the poems of Hafiz. The second reason was some books and some news in the case of government newspaper were considered inappropriate for public due to their ethical or political content. This category includes romantic novels, books on the Constitution of France and other republics, the French Revolution, and news about anti-monarchy ideas in the governmental newspaper, or movements for a constitution and demands for individual rights and representative governments labeled as sedition, treason, and activists are called mobs and criminals. Third group, some topics and had very limited audience, such as books related to military techniques, European culinary, and photography, for example, darkroom instructions. All published translations in 19th century Iran amounts to AD titles, 80 to 85 titles. However, the ratio of subjects in the printed works differs from that of the entire body of translated works. While the 5 most common subjects among all translations are history, geography, medicine, military, and finally novels, the 5 leading subjects among the printed translations are history, medicine, novels, military, and physics. The rise of novels to the 3rd rank and the decline of geography to the 9th rank is particularly noteworthy. From the beginning of the translation movement in Iran, in addition to important practical subjects such as medicine and military science, the subject of history, historical biography, and geography held the largest share among the translated works. It appears that after centuries of disregarding Europeans and European scientific and technological progress, the Iranian royal court, once drawn into great game of the world powers, became keenly interested in learning about the history of European nations and their leaders, as well as understanding the geography of the world and Iran's place within it. The crown prince, who commanded the Iranian army during the First and Second Russo-Iranian Wars, believed that studying the lives of leaders such as Alexander, Napoleon, and Peter the Great would help him become a successful ruler. In his court, alongside translation on military sciences and medicine, several historical works were translated, including the history of the victories of Napoleon, the history of Alexander, and the rise and fall of Roman Empire. Following an order from Amir Kabir, who founded the Dar al-Funun, the Iranian envoy in Paris sent 293 books on various subjects of science and technology, but 323 maps, of all which arrived in Tehran in 1849. And this shows that how maps were very important for them to understand the geography of the world and, as I said, the place of Iran there. After the dismissal and execution of Amir Kabir in 1851, his reformist initiatives, including the introduction of modern science and technology to Iran, lost much of their momentum. In the absence of a comprehensive policy, the translation of scientific books was primarily carried out by the instructors of Dar al-Funun for teaching purpose, while translations in other fields were chosen by courtiers under the direct supervision of the king. This courtly translation became more arbitrary after the establishment of the Translation Bureau. Almost 90% of the translated but unpublished works during the second half of the 19th century were undertaken at the request of the King Nasreddin Shah. For example, after the establishment of the Translation Bureau in 1871, 62 titles in history and biographical history, 68 titles in geography and travel account, and 21 novels were translated, but only less than 10 titles out of these 150 titles were printed. The Shah traveled to Europe 3 times between 1873 and 1889. Owing to his keen interest in travel, translations of travel accounts and issues of the magazine Le Tour du Monde increased rapidly during this period. Even Ibn Battuta's travel account, known as the Rihla, was translated into Persian and published as a serial in the government newspaper. The absence of a general policy for selecting translations subjects is evidence from the distribution of the translated titles. While there are 10 translation books about Napoleon, more than 50 travel accounts, and over 20 novels, only one single book was translated in the field of philosophy. Descartes' Discourse on Method was translated in 1863 at the suggestion of the French diplomat in Tehran, Arthur de Gobineau. However, the translation was defective from the beginning. The French phrase bon sens or good sense was translated as ma'ash, a term entirely unrelated to what Descartes meant in the opening sentence of his work. Interestingly, in the introduction, the translator remarks that although our scholars deemed it unnecessary to read such books, and those philosophers like Descartes are like Alcor, which is a very dim star compared to the sun, which represents our own philosophers, he nevertheless undertook the translation in keeping with the maxim that knowing something is better than ignorance. It is worth noting that the first French Persian dictionary was not compiled until 16 years after the translations of Descartes' work. And the reliable translation of Descartes' Discourse on Method was translated 80 years after the first one. A review of all translated titles reveals that none of the most influential works of the era in science and technology or humanities were translated into Persian. Works by Michael Faraday, Charles Lyell, Louis Pasteur, Mary Somerville, Friedrich Hegel, and many others remained unknown in translation. Practical needs and the introductory level of instruction at the country's only modern school restricted translators largely to secondary sources. Even within those secondary sources, localization and cultural adaptation played a significant role. Although the earliest scientific books at Darul Funun were direct translations of lecture notes or textbooks by European instructors, many other works in physics, mathematics, chemistry, and related fields were authored by Iranians during this period. A brief examination of these authored works shows that they were, in fact, modified versions of European books adapted for Iranian students and audience. For example, in the second half of the 19th century, more than 20 books in mathematics were produced, of which only 4 were translated. Similarly in chemistry and so on and so forth. And also they changed the title of the books. For example, a book in geology, the name changed to Tazkirat al-Arz, or ophthalmology to Ziya al-Nazirin, or dermatology as Zinat al-Abdan. Localization and cultural adaptation were also applied to translated novels and plays. European proper names, characters, and maxims were changed to familiar Persian items. For example, Jean-Baptiste Molière's comedy, The Forced Marriage, which progressed through a series of 10 stages, was reduced to 5 stages, and names were changed to Musa, Zuleha, Haydar Bey, and some characters like that. And however, despite Iran's closer cultural and literary connection with Russia, more sophisticated and demanding works such as Crime and Punishment and War and Peace were never translated until 1950s. Now, to summarize the story, the most significant aspects of the 19th century translation movement and its impact on Iranian society must be summarized as follows. There were no well-developed plans to become acquainted with European science, technology, and culture through translation. Even after nearly a century of translation activity, the idea had not yet developed that in order to gain a comprehensive understanding of a culture through translation, one must translate a diverse range of work encompassing its deepest values and everyday realities, including literary, historical, philosophical, religious, social, scientific, technical, legal, and political texts. Second, translations were carried out for a small circle of high-ranking Iranians, and as a result, thousands of hours of intellectual labor remained fruitless for the wider society. Third, the late introduction of the printing press in Iran made a gap between translation and printing press, and printing press was very expensive in Iran as I compared the prices. The third is printers found it most profitable to publish religious works or titles familiar to Iranian readers, such as poetry and historical texts. In the absence of a general policy for translating scientific and technical terminology, different equivalents were used for the same terms, making the reading of these books very difficult. And two more items, finally. The mainstream traditional schools and the ulama, who opposed many important ideas, played no constructive role in engaging with European knowledge. For example, they continued teaching traditional books, and by 1902, we had more than seven back-to-back publications of Gushchi's Hay'a. So, I would like to end my talk with this general conclusion. A literate Iranian at the end of the 19th century, who had studied all these translated works, even the unpublished ones, would have acquired fragmented and in some cases inaccurate information about modern Europe. However, forming a coherent understanding of the transformation that made Europe the dominant global power, particularly in science and technology, would have been impossible by using this translation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. As we started 15 minutes late, so we're on time. We will have 15 minutes of discussion. Try to finish at 11:30 for coffee break and regroup at 11:45. And the lunch will be 15 minutes late as well. So let's get at least 2 rounds of questions. And then after three questions, then you will respond. So we'll try to get questions for everyone. I saw Harun first and Roberto next.
I think I have 2 questions, one for the first 2 speakers and one for Tofigh at the end. To the first 2 speakers, both of your talks featured titles that used Samarat, right? So just, there is like fruit in the title of the works that you study. And of course, this is an image of a tree yielding fruit, right? There is the tree of science and then there is the fruit of science. Now, the tree of science imagery is ubiquitous enough, I think, across the board. You will find it also in Europe, for example. But titles bearing the fruit of astronomy or the fruit of medicine are a lot more ubiquitous in the, I guess, Islamic world generally. And I do wonder, how would you translate that in a way that would be legible to modern readers? Would it be utility, or what other word would you use? And to Tofigh, Professor Haiderzade, I also enjoyed your talk very much. I do love the perspective that you bring with the comparative sort of dominance of genres and the monetary world of these publications. But when I listened to you, what I wondered was why history was such an important thing. And I'm more than a little self-interested here, because as you probably experience, history is in a state of crisis. I mean, it has been in a state of crisis in the United States. We can't really sell history to our students. Why is it, or how is it that you have a reading audience that reads a lot of history and prefers history over any other genre of text in 19th century Qajar Iran? And how is it different from what we have right now? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's get a couple more questions, Roberto, and then yes, I'm.
Thank you to all 3 speakers. A very short comment and a question for Haila. I agree with you that the fact that manuscripts are missing attests that, as most of this work had no or almost no circulation in the places. This is quite common in missionary works. I mean, their audience was rather to justify their work with the Catholic Church rather than to have a real penetration. We have many cases in this. The question is, we know something about the family background of Xavier. It is quite interesting because in the first half of 16th century we see that many converts from Moriscos and Muslims had a role in this kind of literature, but the sources that you mentioned suggest something different. Also the name Lux Basque, coming from northern Spain. Navarra. Okay, so I want to know something more about the family background.
John, can we get your question?
Yes. Thank you. First of all, for Professor Ahmet Tunc Sen, I find it quite interesting to see that actually the reform period in the Ottoman Empire, commonly associated with Selim III, in fact started much earlier. And I have found myself that, for example, the Vauban's treatises, the French originals, had been already bought from France under Mustafa III, and when Selim III looked in the boxes, he decided they should now be published and translated. So it's very interesting one should maybe change a bit the perception of reform in the Ottoman Empire, and it started, in fact, before Selim III. I was very grateful for Professor Haiderzade's account of translation in Iran, because I was always surprised to see how little important it seemed for the Iranians to know more about the first translations. For example, I've never got the answer, what is the first translation from a Western language in Iran? Whereas in Turkey, yes, telemak, tercümesi. It may not be the first translation, but everybody accepts it as such. Well, I have seen these lists of translations, unpublished manuscripts, and I have one question. What do we know about the originals? You know, are they just texts, say, tarjumeh, but we do not know who were the authors, the French or English or Russian or others, and do we have any idea of the quality of these translations? Are they complete, for example, or are they just a few chapters? That's what I would be interested to know. Thank you very much.
I'm going to use my privilege to add my question to this three. We go to you and then we come back to three more questions here. So my question would be to Haila, that do you see in the Jesuits' writing any kind of praise of the Indian tolerance? So one of my colleagues said that the Enlightenment thinkers who wrote about tolerance, like John Locke, were big admirers of India, partly Ottoman Empire too, that their tolerance actually make them wealthier. And so do you see any word of any respect for tolerance? And in terms of the political theory, I'm going to link it to Tofigh's presentation too. Obviously, I didn't see any term hurriyat, which is the key term that appears in the 19th century celebration of hurriyat and musawat. Even the journal that the young Ottomans published here in London titled Hurriyat. So if there is hurriyat, of course, please email me. I will be very happy to hear that. But with Tofigh's thing is that, you know, we know one Iranian, let's say Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who seem to be traveling a lot. And so aren't those Iranians also reading texts published in Ottoman, in Istanbul, in Cairo? And could there be other ways of translating things without publishing? Meaning, how can someone like Jamaluddin al-Afghani appear if there's this much of little translation? Is that there are maybe other ways of gaining knowledge, like our students who don't read books, but they get all the knowledge from TikToks. Maybe there were corresponding ways of finding out about the rest of the world without translating and publishing. So 3 questions plus mine, if you want to go around. Haile, you want to? Yeah, and you don't have to respond to all of them. You can choose and leave for the sake of time.
Yes. Regarding Samarat, thank you. Regarding Samarat, I would say that it's like the genre that existed in Latin. It was a specula. No, it's like an encyclopedia. When we look closer look in Samarat al-Falāsifa, it likes an encyclopedia only relating who these philosophers were and during which emperor they lived. And regarding the family background of Xavier, he was the great nephew of San Xavier, Francis Xavier, the apostle of Asia, apostle of Japan. So from Navarra, he was Basque. And about tolerance, there are many Jesuit sources from this era. For example, Xavier also wrote a Portuguese treatise called the Mughal Padishah, but the Jesuits were very interested in political and military aspects of the reign, and they reported many aspects of these kind of economical, for example, type of information about Jahangir's court, for example, in this Mughal Padishah. We have, but I didn't come across any word specifically about tolerance. I think that the Jesuits in the 17th century were not able to understand that, because as also al-Sattār wrote, they were very naive in religious respect. They were, for us, from our perspective, they were really fanatics, and they couldn't understand this tolerant atmosphere that were in, especially during Akbar's reign.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can say a few things about the Samarat question. How I thought about it a lot, whether fruit would be the right word to use for translation, and I share your concerns about its, lack of it's not that comprehensible for non-specialist audience, but still this is really what they mean in their own writings, especially when it's related to astral sciences. I mean, not only in the titles, but in the prefaces of many astrological and astronomical texts, you come across references to why should we study the science of the stars? And they say, well, the Samarat of this is just either to understand the God's, cosmic creation, as well as to understand and compute time. So maybe yield or utility or benefit, and depending on the context or depending on the audience, I think we can use different combinations. But the tree of knowledge metaphor doesn't fully fit into the Samarat question is in the particular context of astral sciences. The Shajara or Ashjar, I think, makes more sense in that kind of tree of knowledge discussion. Yeah. Can I say a few things for Professor Strauss' question? I mean, thank you first of all for your comment. I don't know what to say. I'm not a big fan of periodization. Because periodization is just a historian's construct, whether we started with Selim III or whether we can trace it back in the history. I mean, it's of course an open question. I'm just happy that what I had said resonated with you in terms of not starting things with the Selim III. But one can still speak of reform in earlier centuries as well. In the Ottoman context, right? I mean, when we look into the writings of all the Ottoman advice literature, starting from mid-16th century, they were trying to reform certain things, right? Not always on the ground of what the Europeans were doing from, let's say, the 17th century onwards, but still there was an inner logic of this need to change certain things. And that can also be categorized within this context of reform. That's, yeah, all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
There is Nizami Jadid, for example, a very specific term which didn't exist before. And there is also Nizami Jadid in Muhammad Ali's Egypt, who adopted it. So there is a sort of specificity about this period, in my opinion.
Yeah, no question about that. Yeah, I agree, but again, periodization is always a question I, approach with some sense of suspicion. Yeah.
Okay, let me start with Dr. Harun's question. Always in our tradition in Iran, we have a very important place for Akhbar al-Muluk. And in all historical books, you find that kings got advice from vizier or books how to administer a state. But to directly relate it to what happened to the translation movement, we have recorded a story that the Crown Prince of Iran, involved in the war with Russia, he had a French advisor, and he asked him, tell me, what is the difference between you and us? The same sun shines over us. We have the same human being. What makes us different? And the conclusion is that we reached to this conclusion that we have to study what happened to you in the past, and we learned from that. And they found that if they learn more about leaders like Napoleon, like Peter the Great, and many people like them, they can administer better. And also you have to add the climate, the atmosphere in a Shia state, which Imam plays a very important role in leading the society. I don't say that they consider Peter the Great as Imam or like that, but it is a general concept that if you have a very good leader, then you can lead the society better. That is why we see a lot of books translated about not only history but biographical history. We have more than 12 translations about Napoleon, 5, 6 about Peter the Great, and even the Queens of England. Okay, though it was very weird for them that a woman can lead the society that time. And to Dr. Strauss' question, the origin of some of these books are known. Some are not. Specifically scientific books, they translated it, or they actually used different books and authored the book out of different translations. And actually, it is a part of my project. I discovered one of the books that for 150 years we didn't know the origin of the first physics books that was used in Iran, Iran's first Polytechnic, which I found the origin, which they mixed a French book and a German book, and then they created this final book that was thought in. But it is a project that I involved partially in it to find the origin of these books. Nowadays, fortunately, we have all these digital resources, and finding those books are a little easier compared to 10 years ago. And about Cemil Aydin Afghani, he learned French in 2 years, and he knew French. He knew obviously Arabic, and since most of these ideas first translated in Arabic and then Ottoman Turkish, and he knew French, then he had a better chance to learn about all these things.
Certain words have drawn my attention into historical trajectory of ideas in Muslim societies. Like Mahdi Akhir Zaman regarding Bayezid II, should I take it on the hagiographic account or some cult perspectives. That is something that's posing a question to me. Regarding Ziaul Nazrin for ophthalmology, what draws my attention is the specific scientific ontological standards for the nomenclature, especially nomenclature and terminology. So Ziaul Nazrin, especially this Arabic composition, it doesn't reflect the ontological essence of ophthalmology. So this is my observation. Dara Shikoor's legacy regarding that intercommunal religious dialogue that has taken place in the Mughal period in the court of Akbar. So we see a paradigm shift, especially in the legacy that was left by Dara Shikoor, Prince Dara Shikoor, especially because he has focused on whether it is Sakinatul Awliya or Safinatul Awliya, whereas Sir Akbar was actually the Persian translation of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and I have translated this translation into Urdu. So this paradigm shift actually belittles, or just, I won't be using the word belittles, rather sits at margins, push into something like backbenches, that first dialogue that has taken place between Islamic theology and the Western Western theological discourses, especially the Jesuits. So, what were the historical aspects of this draws our attention. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This shows that how much enthusiasm you created. So please continue during the coffee house, and hopefully some of the questions will be answered by your published articles. Thank you.